everyone again. I'm Dr. Heather Hatch. I am the Collections Manager at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, and I'd like to welcome you to our daily MOA Talks live conversation. So today I'm going to be doing an Archaeology 101 introduction, so just some basic information about what archaeology is and what it is that archaeologists do. So I am just going to get my live stream up here on my other computer so that I can see if you guys have any questions for me. So just give me half a second here and I'll be able to see what's going on. Oop, there I am in stereo. All right, so now I'll be able to see if anybody pops up with any questions, and please do feel free if you have any at any point in time just to drop in a comment, and I should be able to see it and let you know if I can have an answer for you. Just one moment here. It's going to get some shares set up here so that everybody can know that we're live streaming. Oof. There we go. All right. So Archaeology 101. So I think what I'll start with then is a definition of what archaeology is. So archaeology is the study of the past by looking at remains and objects from people who lived in the past. So it's really focused on people and the things that people have made and changes that people have made to the environment as well. So I apologize if there's any background noise. I am working from home today, so there's a few other people around who might be providing some background ambiance. So the first kinds of things I want to go through is just to sort of look at what, when we're talking about the remains that people have left in the past, what does it actually mean, and then how do we interpret those sorts of things? So the first thing that people leave behind, obviously, and probably what most people think about when they're talking about archaeology, is artifacts. Now I know that Katie did an extensive discussion about artifacts and had some to show as well on her live talk from Friday. So if you have any more specific questions about artifacts, and if you want to see some examples of artifacts that Katie had, then I recommend that you go and find that video and have a look at it. You should be able to find it on our Facebook videos page. I believe we're also porting those over to our YouTube page, and we should be able to have those accessible for people to see there as well at any point in the future. So artifacts then are objects that are altered by humans. So they're things that people have made or changed. And this can be things like tools, it can be like objects like, of course I'm blanking on good examples, but so tools or like materials that they've made, things that they've altered. One group of objects that I don't think that Katie talked about would be some things like faunal remains. So if you imagine that people have gone hunting, then if they are successful in their hunt, then obviously they have made a change to the status of the animal that they have successfully captured. And then we can find those kinds of remains of things that people have been eating, or if they have like domesticated animals as well, we can find those remains and they can tell us, what people are eating. They can give us a little bit of information about the technologies that people use for hunting and also for butchering animals to prepare them for food. So those are just some other kinds of things that we do find in the archaeological record that can give you a sense of what we mean by altered by humans. So it can be like taking some clay and making a pot, that's altered, or taking a stone and making a projectile point, or, taking metal and smelting it into objects as well. So archaeology can be found all over the world. Our focus obviously is about archaeology here in Ontario, so a lot of my examples are going to reflect that. But again, if anybody has any questions, just let me know and I'll do my best to answer. So other than artifacts, the main thing that we find is what we call features. So these are other traces of human activity. Some people define it as being non-portable remains. So these can be traces of human activity, like a fire pit, for example, where someone's dug something up and then they burned something there. So we might be able to find the hole, and we might be able to find the charcoal, for example, that's left from the wood that's been burned in that fire pit. and also the changes that the fire has made to the soil in which the pit was dug. So those are the kinds of things that we can see and interpret archaeologically to help us understand what humans were doing. They can also be things like post molds, where there was an organic object, like a wooden post that was sunk into the ground. Maybe the wood has all rotted away, but as it did so, it left behind stains in the soil that we can see. And then we can understand as archaeologists, when we see these sort of round stains in the ground, that maybe that indicates that there was something there that's no longer present. And if we trace out a line of these kinds of post molds, we can see, for example, maybe there was a structure here, maybe there was a fence. It can give us more clues about, again, human activity in the past. Other kinds of examples of features would be, for example, a storage pit that somebody dug to like keep something in, or even like a cellar. We also have to, when we're talking about features, we can consider what we call the built environment. So when humans have created like structures and monuments, so buildings, for example, or even big things like the pyramids, those would be considered features of the built environment. We can also talk about landscape features as well. So humans not only have an impact from their, like we can see human activity not only from ways that they directly altered things by building things like, but they can also make changes to the landscape. So for example, building a dam not only changes, you don't only have the built environment of the actual object of the dam itself, but you can see how it's affected the whole landscape in which it's situated. So how it changes the course of the river that's being dammed, for example. New places are going to be flooded, other places might be exposed, and it's going to affect how, if there's like a big flood, for example, where that flood water is going to go. So these can have major environmental impacts that affect not just the direct area, but more broadly as well. So we can also see things in terms of landscapes where people can affect the local environment around them. So maybe they've introduced new kinds of plants, or they've changed, for example, if they've cut down forests to build farmland, that's another way that humans can alter the landscape. And we can see that, and sort of it gives us the ability to understand how people have changed have created changes that are lasting into the present, or even if they aren't necessarily lasting into the present, we can see those in the past and understand what they might have done that's changed the environment around them. So again, so that's really, all these different impacts are part of archaeology. So we're trying to understand peoples of the past, what they were doing, why they were living, what was important to them, and all of these different kinds of archaeological remains can help us understand that. So there's, sorry, try not to jostle things too much. We can also say that some kinds of archaeological remains sort of cross that line between an artifact, which is like an object, and a feature, which is more like just a trace of change. So if you look at a shipwreck, for example, you can say that it is a feature in the sense that it could contain artifacts that are portable and that we can interpret in and of their own. So we can treat it that way, but we can also see the ship itself as an artifact in and of itself. So sometimes when they find a shipwreck, maritime archaeologists or nautical archaeologists will record that as though it is just a feature, and they'll leave it in place, but in some cases they might remove it and study it like it's an object or an artifact as well. So, the lines can be a little bit blurry between what is an object or what is an artifact and what is a feature sometimes. So the next big question then is, what is an archaeological site? So we talk about sites a lot in archaeology, and what we mean by that is a place where we find these traces of human activity. So usually it's places where we're finding specific features and specific artifacts together. And so that gives us a place to look to sort of understand and interpret these archaeological remains. So sites are the places where we find artifacts and features. And the other big concept that's really important in archaeology is what we call context. So we talk a lot about archaeological context. And so what that means, or what context is really the key to understanding how to make sense of these objects and features that we're seeing. So how do they relate to each other? So Katie talked a little bit about this in her talk about artifacts, and I know that she's going to be doing a talk next Monday that's going to be getting into more details about what context means. But for now, just as a basic definition, when we're talking about context is we're looking at trying to understand how all these different elements together helps us answer more questions that we might have about the peoples of the past. So for example, just having an artifact by itself doesn't really let us know or answer as many questions if we don't know where it came from. So if we have an object, but we don't know where it's from, that really limits what we can say about it. So we might be able to say, oh, it's made of this kind of material. We might be able to say a little bit about how it was made, but that's really all we can say. If we know where an object is from, then we can, relate that to other objects were found at the same site, for example. That gives us more tools to interpret what this is, what kinds of activity was going on in the past, and then gives us a richer view of what the lives of past peoples were like. So it can also help us interpret the sites themselves. So we can say, if we're finding certain kinds of objects, maybe it indicates that this is just a campsite versus this is a whole village or just somebody's little homestead or, part of a city. So all of these things together are what help us create more or richer interpretations of archaeology. So again, if we know where a site is in a landscape, we can answer more questions about, where people were living. And how that has changed over time. If we go back to our shipwreck example, then context can tell us things like what this ship was used for. So was it transporting people or was it transporting things? And what kinds of things? So knowing where it was found, giving it that spatial context, can also tell us things about, how people were traveling, what they knew about trade, how they understood about the waterways, and the ship itself can give us some kinds of information like the technologies that they have available, how much they understood about navigation, say, and then, was this ship just meant for traveling locally or along a particular river, or was it sturdy enough to be used on the ocean? So it gives us all these different kinds of contexts that, again, help us understand and get a richer view about peoples in the past. So then moving on from what sites are, talking a little bit about context. Again, Katie's going to get into that a little bit more detail next week. We can talk a bit about how archaeologists can find sites. So the truth is that most archaeological sites are probably already known to somebody. A lot of major archaeological discoveries of the past were really can be traced back to, people who consider themselves wise, explorers and so forth, just asking people what they already knew. So a lot of the times these places, these big sites, were already known by local people, and it's just a matter of, somebody who considers himself an archaeologist getting a hold of that information. So a lot of the times these places are already known. Sometimes they're publicly known, so especially ones that are associated with large structures. Again, the pyramids are kind of hard to miss. And then others can be recorded in historical documents as well. So if someone's written about them in the past, we can find more information about them that way as well. Another way that we can find new archaeological sites is that we can use that context that I was talking about before. So once we start to know where we're finding certain kinds of sites, if we look in the places where those sites have been found previously, so for example, if we know that there tended to be villages about 700 years ago that were sort of looking over rivers that have a particular kind of like fish migration, for example, then we can take that information and look in other kinds of places where we have those same sorts of things. So they're on a rise, they're on a river, they've got these kinds of resources around, so that'd be a good place to look for these other kinds of sites as well. So even though we can start to recognize these patterns about where to find archaeological sites, we still have to just go out and look for them. So just because there might be a site, because there's some indications, like maybe we've found something written, or we've talked to somebody, or we've sort of made an extrapolation based on what we know from some other sites, we still have to go and check for ourselves. So just because it could be there doesn't mean it is, or doesn't mean that, it is what people think it is. So there's still that element of having to actually go out and see. We've seen some cases, I think, more recently where people have been using satellite imagery to find sites where they found things that look like shapes, for example, like that are very geometric, that can't be easily explained as being a natural occurrence. And so people have said, aha, I found it like a lost village, or I found a lost city, or something along those lines. We still have to actually go out and look, because sometimes the technologies that we use can trick us into thinking that we're seeing things that aren't there. And also, it's just to be really certain, we just have to go out and actually look and see what's actually there before we can make those kinds of claims. We call that ground truthing in some cases, just to make sure that what we think is there really is. So some other ways that we can find sites one is just called field walking. So this is when we just go out to a place where we think there might be a site, and we just walk around and look. So we can do this sort of systematically, like everybody lines up in a line and you all just walk straight forward. And anytime you see something, you can mark down that you found an artifact, or not, if there's not anything there. So this is really just to observe artifacts and features that we're noticing on the surface. So in Ontario, this is pretty common to do after fields have been plowed. So Ontario is a very agricultural environment still. We have a lot of urbanization, but a lot of the ground is still used for agriculture. So after fields have been plowed, things have been churned up a little bit, so that gives us an opportunity to see things that might have been hiding under the surface. It's also a time when there's not a lot of plant growth that would make it more difficult to see if there are objects or artifacts that are in the ground there. Also, if you encounter, for example, an old foundation wall, that can give you a pretty good clue that there might be an old farmstead or an old house there. So just sort of walking around and looking is one way that we can find sites. There's also more systematic surveys, where instead of just walking along, maybe you're stopping every 10 feet or 15 feet or 50 feet rather, and maybe you'll dig what we call a test pit. And so it's literally what it sounds like. It's a pit that's a test to see if we find anything. And these sort of systematic surveys can help us sort of find sites that are in impossible areas. So we can do this underwater as well. So we can do these kinds of transect surveys where you lay out like a line, and you say, I'm just going to drive in this particular line, and then I'm going to come back, go forward a little bit, and then come back along the other way, and go forward a little bit, and go again. And so that will help you sort of get a sense of what might be underwater. And these kinds of surveys, and we can also do them on ground as well, use different kinds of technology. So instead of just looking with our eyes, we're using different kinds of imaging devices that can help us see what might not be so easily seen with our eyes. So for example, in underwater surveys, they're often using sonar. So it's sort of sending out sound waves, and those sound waves are reflecting back and showing sort of a pattern of things that are underwater. And if you encounter certain shapes, for example, again, I was saying if you find really geometric shapes, often that's an indication that there's something there that's man-made as opposed to natural. And that gives you an idea that maybe you should investigate and see what's there. We also have geophysical tests that we can do on land. So we have things like magnetometry, where you're looking for different magnetic alignments. So if you imagine, if you dig something up, if you dig a pit into the ground, you're changing how the dirt is aligned. So the earth, the dirt usually wants to be aligned according to, lined up magnetically according to the poles. Once you dig that up, all bets are off. And if you find these places where you're getting like weird magnetic signatures, it could be an indication that somebody has dug something up there in the past, and gives you, again, something to look at. There's other kinds of geophysical tests as well, where you can do resistivity, where you're sending electrical currents into the ground and sort of looking for different strange patterns that might indicate that something's buried, for example. And then there's ground penetrating radar as well, which can also bring up some of these different anomalies that again give you a sense that there might be something buried underground. So once we have an idea that maybe there is something there, we can move on to test excavation. So instead of doing just a pit to say, hey, is there anything in here, we can say, we think there's something here, Or maybe we know that there is something here and we want to get a little bit more information. And so they'll do a little bit of more systematic investigation. So sometimes they'll do this to test what they've found on through geophysical survey. Sometimes they'll say, okay, we know that there's a site here because we found artifacts and they're concentrated in one area, but we're not sure how big it is. So let's do some little excavations to see if we can find the edge. So we know artifacts are more concentrated in one place, but are they less dense over here? And when do we stop finding them? How far away do we have to go? So there's different sorts of ways you can sort of test this information. And I'm just gonna see if I have any questions yet, but not so far. But again, if you have any, please just leave a comment and I'll do my best to answer. Hopefully this has all been relatively clear so far. So those are sort of test excavations. And once we sort of have an idea that there is a site and we think that there's a reason that, you know, there's questions that we can answer, or maybe the site is in danger from being from being developed or dug up, or there's some other kind of impact on it that we think is worth removing everything, then we might go on to a full excavation. A lot of the times we actually try not to do that at this stage. We have so many materials that we've already dug up from other excavations that we really have to stop and ask ourselves, is it worth it to take this material out of the ground? Because archaeology, excuse me, I promise I don't have the coronavirus, but I'm home anyway. We have to make an assessment to decide whether or not it's going to be worth it to dig up a site and remove everything, because once it's out of the ground, it's gone. You can't put it back. So then, to talk a little bit about excavation, what does that mean? It means removing and recording these archaeological traces that we talked about. So removing objects and recording and removing features as well. So if you think about a feature, some of them I described are pretty ephemeral. They don't really leave a lot there. So you can't really take a post mold, so it's just really a stain in the dirt. You can't really take that out and keep it. So you really have to be careful about recording everything. And so this is what we say when we talk about archaeology being a very destructive science or a destructive way of learning. So we can't really put things back. We get that one shot to do it right, to record everything as it's coming, as we find it, essentially. So there's a lot of different technologies that we can use today that are helpful in recording. So we can use photography is excellent. So we can take pictures of things as they are in the ground. That helps us sort of keep that information in that context. We take a lot of notes. That's really the big one. We do a lot of measuring. We try to do things in a very systematic way. So we don't just dig a hole that's any particular size. We want to dig them in a very set way. So usually they're 1 meter square holes, and we might have a bunch of them side by side, so they all build up into a big trench. But we know we can record everything that's come out of one particular area. We often do this in a grid system, and it just helps us keep that context about where things were found. So what objects are found together, what features are found together, what objects are found with what features, and then how do those things line up across a site to help us give that full picture. So the recording is actually really integral. It's not just about taking the things, it's about understanding where they came from. And that's really a big, one of the most important things to understand about archaeology is that it's not just about the objects or about the features, but it's about how things relate to each other. That context is really very key. And again, Katie's going to talk about some different ways that we can record and understand context as well next Monday, I believe, in her MOA live talks. So as I was saying, we have some technology. We use photography. These days, people are starting to use 3D scanning also. So you can go in there if you have a large scale 3D scanner. You can actually take a 3D scan of a site in progress and sort of rebuild sort of a virtual version of that site. So the original version is gone, but you might be able to sort of replace things in a virtual context. And so that's a new way of recording. That's new. So I've got a couple of questions, so I'm just gonna answer those as we go. The first is from Domani. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I've never actually heard you say your name out loud. So the question is that the process sounds very meticulous. And have you ever witnessed anything being discovered by pure dumb luck? And the answer is absolutely yes. A lot of the times it's less that this happens by archaeologists, but often it could happen by members of the public. So for one example, I did my PhD research down in the Bahamas, and I was looking for early colonial settlement materials. But while I was there, the first year that I was there were people who were just excavating. I think they were putting in a pool in their backyard, and they came across what we would call a privy, so like an old outdoor toilet essentially, that was just full of different kinds of things that people had thrown away, because you've got a big hole in your where all your crap is going, literally, so you might as well throw your other broken junk in there too. So privies often have a lot of different archaeological materials where people have thrown things out, and these people just, again, they weren't expecting to find it, but they did. And so they encountered all these sort of neat objects and artifacts that had been associated with that particular privy. So yes, it absolutely does happen. And as I was saying, a lot of sites are found by people who already know what they are, or people who aren't archaeologists, who stumble across them out of pure dumb luck. And hopefully, if we're lucky, they'll let archaeologists know that they're there. So hopefully that answers that question. The other question I have is how do we know where to excavate? So what are some of the indicators? And so that can vary, and that's sort of one of the reasons we do these surveys at first, is we're trying to get a sense of where there might be archaeology that we want to investigate. So, for example, if we're using geophysical techniques and there's something indicates that, for example, there might be a buried feature, like a wall or a pit, then that would be that would give us some hint about where maybe we would like to dig. If we've just done some field walking and we found a place where there's a large concentration of artifacts, that might give us an indication that there's something else that's that there's more materials there that are still buried that haven't been brought up, and that would be another way that we have an idea that this is a particular place on a site where we might want to excavate. So it's these kinds of clues, and these are, again, it's another reason that we do these kinds of surveys before we would undertake a full excavation. There might be also features, like large-scale features, like buildings, for example. You might want to excavate close to a building. If you know, again, patterns, you can say, well, we know, generally speaking, that people had their privies outside in the backyard of their house. If we have an old house that we're excavating, we have an idea of, where we might look if we're trying to find that kind of feature. So again, it comes down to what can we find on the surface, what can we find through surveys, and what can we find through sort of research and understanding the patterns of archaeology. So I hope that answers your question. That was from Sarah Dorman. Again, if anybody else has any further questions, please feel free to jump in and ask. So then moving along from archaeology, so we've talked a lot about sort of what that means, so removing those objects, recording things that can't be removed. And all these records, they form what we actually call the archaeological record, along with the actual objects that were removed, the notes, the photographs, everything that all that other context we've collected forms what we call the archaeological record. So then what happens after the excavation? Is the archaeology done? The answer is no. Archaeologists have a responsibility to sort of to share the information that they found. So we're going to take all of those objects, we're going to take all the information we have about them, we're going to continue to try and get more information, because when you're taking something out of the ground, it might not really be clear to you what it is. You might need to do some research to understand, okay, what kind of material is this? Like, this is, okay, we've got a piece of pottery, but what do we know about this kind of pottery? Where have we found it before? What is it made of? Do we know anything about the people who've made it elsewhere that we can use to explain what we're seeing in this particular context? So there's a lot of different research that goes on into understanding the things that we've taken out during the excavation phase. So that's also very, very important. And so we call this the analysis and research. And then once we have that sort of better understanding, we have a responsibility to share that information as well. So archaeology isn't just done for our own personal curiosity. It's usually done because we want to help protect this information about the past and to share it and to learn more sort of about the human condition in the past and how that, you know, we want to understand how people were like us as much as how they were different. And so we want to get that rich understanding of our own history and the understandings of the history of the people who live in the places that we are now. So how things have changed over time. So in Ontario, a lot of archaeology is actually done in advance of development. So there's actual regulations and laws in Ontario that say that you have to do you have to investigate to see if there's anything of archaeological interest before you can do any kind of development project. And these laws varies from province to province. They vary internationally, of course. So wherever you're watching from, if it's not Ontario, you might have some very different contexts about like what happens to artifacts, who gets to keep them, and so forth. In Ontario, any archaeological materials have to be or any archaeological investigation has to be done by a licensed archaeologist. And if you are a licensed archaeologist who's conducting an archaeological investigation, you have certain legal responsibilities. And that includes creating reports that explain all of the materials and the work that's been done, and everything that you understand about that has to be given in a report to the province, as well as perhaps a report to your clients as well. As I was saying, a lot of archaeological work in Ontario is driven by development. So anytime there's a new subdivision, they're putting in a new wind farm, if they're doing some road work, they have to do an investigation, and that might just be research. If they determine that there's not going to be anything there based on what we know of the area, based on other historical research that they've done, they say there's probably nothing to find. That might be as far as it goes. But if they think there might be something, then it has to go on to these other steps where we do surveys and then test excavation to determine what's there and what we can say about it. Excuse me. So that's sort of that reporting and analysis point that's really important. There's also the artifacts themselves. Once they've come out of the ground, they need some attention. So as soon as you take something out of its environmental context from where you found it, so for example, if you find it buried underground, if you find it underwater, you find it in a dry cave, or even if you just find it lying in a field, as soon as you take that artifact out of wherever it's from and move it into a lab context, you've changed its environment a lot. And you're exposing it to new kinds of risks, really. So maybe you've changed the temperature that it's being stored at, or the humidity that it's being exposed to. It might be now exposed to the air for the first time in a very long time. And these things can affect different kinds of objects in different ways. So this morning, Katie was talking about organic objects, like baskets in the kids' craft that she was doing, where you were making a cute little woven basket. And organic objects are very vulnerable to oxygen. So once they are exposed to that environment where they're getting a lot more oxygen, they can start to decay very quickly. The same thing with metals. Once they are exposed to new oxygen, they can start to break down and rust and so forth. And so part of our responsibility as archaeologists is to try and keep those objects as stable as possible. So we've taken them out of the ground, which is already a destructive process, and then we are exposing them to this new environment, which is also can be destructive. So we have to do what we can to try and conserve them, to keep them as stable as possible. So there's other kinds of risks that they might be exposed to that are new as well, like pests, for example, human carelessness. We might lose things if we're not careful about them, or they might be exposed to new, like they might be in an environment where they might be poorly stored. They could be damaged from water or fire, all kinds of different new risks that they're being exposed to. So it's our responsibility to make sure that they're cared for properly. And obviously, for us at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, that's a big part of what we do, is taking care of those objects to make sure that they are around. So again, going back to Ontario, and the archaeological license that people are issued, they do have a responsibility of care to look after these objects. So in Ontario's rules, people don't actually own archaeological heritage. If it's been excavated under license, then it belongs to the people of Ontario, and it's held in trust by the archaeologists or public institutions who are looking after these materials for the public. So we don't own those kinds of collections, but we have a responsibility as archaeologists and people who are associated with that profession to look after them for people of the future. So they're not just, again, it's not just something that we're doing for our own curiosity. We have a responsibility to care for that and to provide that information about these heritage materials and sites for people in the future as well. So I'm going to step back a little bit and talk, I think, about archaeological dating, which is another big thing that people often ask us is, how do you know how old something is? So there's really two kinds of main ways that we can date something. The first is relative dating. And so this is just sort of knowing how old something is in relation to something else. So we can maybe say something is older or younger than another object. Like maybe I'm trying to figure out how to explain this without getting into giving too much away. So Katie's going to talk a little about seriation. She's going to talk a little bit about stratigraphy as well. So, but just generally speaking, where you find things when you're excavating can give you a sense of how old things are in relation to each other. So something that's buried, you can imagine things that are on the bottom of that might be older than things that are on top. So that's a relative dating. You can say that the object A is older than object B if its context is below the other one. If it was buried first, it's probably older. If it was buried later, it's certainly younger. So that's sort of one way of talking about relative dating. We can also know, we can date both sites and objects in relationship to others. So for example, if we have a particular kind of pottery, this is my pottery, obviously. If we have a particular kind of pottery, and we don't know how old this particular piece is, but we have another piece and we've been able to date it in association with something else, or we're more certain about how old it is. We could say this piece for sure is from a site that's 500 years old. Then we can probably guess that this piece over here, this one again, is maybe also around the same age. So this can be difficult because sometimes styles can last for quite a long time. They can last for decades. They can last for hundreds of years. So it can be difficult to date things in that way, but you can at least probably say that there's some similarity. Today things can change, styles and so forth can change very, very rapidly. So people who are doing archaeology of our time period in the future, and I apologize for my coworker, he's very excitable, if you can hear him in the background barking. Everything's fine. Okay, no, sorry, just the dog. Live streams. Yes, so you can date things sort of in relation to other things as well, and that's what we call sort of relative dating. We can also talk about absolute dating, where you can be more certain about how old things are. Sometimes it's really easy. Sometimes objects, especially from more recent archaeological sites, might have the dates written right on them. So you might have like a piece of ceramic that says, for example, this was made in this factory in 1898. And that can be a pretty good indication of, where or when it was made. Bottles especially often have dates on them. We can also, sometimes you might not have the date specifically, but there might be something else on it that's easily dateable. For example, again, if we look at more industrially produced pottery, there's certain styles, for example, that we can date. We have historical records that say that record the patterns that were made by particular factories in a particular range of years, and so you can date those very specifically. You can say exactly when this was produced, and so you can make some dates based on these kinds of things. And once you have those one dates, then you can go back to your relative dating and you can say, well, other objects that were found with this particular piece of pottery are probably from around the same period. This can be, there can be a few ways that this can get more complicated, but that's the basic understanding of that. There's also the one that I think that most people are familiar with is radiocarbon dating and other kinds of isotopic dating. So these are a little bit more scientific, and I'm not going to go really into the complicated explanation here. But they're based on the principle that certain kinds of elements break down in reliable ways that we can understand. And so we can use that, our understanding of how these things decay, to get an idea of when things start, when that decay process started. So with carbon, it starts to break down after death, essentially, or once something is burned, for example. So charcoal is great. We can date exactly when a piece of, or not exactly, we can date, generally speaking, when a piece of wood was burned, and that can give us a sort of time frame to understand when something was happening. There's also other elements that you can use in similar ways, and we can use, again, those really predictable patterns to understand when something was made, how long it's been buried, all these different kinds of questions. So it goes to sort of this scientific isotopic dating. We've also got tree rings, which are what we call dendrochronology. So tree rings are really an interesting way of dating things. So trees sort of record their own environmental experience every year as they're growing. And so we can see, for example, when there's years where, maybe there was a drought, things are drier, they didn't grow as much, and they record these in their tree rings. So there's lots of information you can get out of those, but they tend to show the same pattern in a particular region. So if you have a tree that was dated 50 years ago, was planted 50 years ago, it's 50 years old, you can look at those tree rings and they'll show a particular pattern of growth. And if you look at another tree, you can compare it and say, okay, well, we know this one is 50 years old. Now we're looking at this tree we think is a little bit older, but we're not sure. So we'll look at those tree rings, and we can say, well, they sort of overlap here. So when this one starts growing, there's like maybe about 20 years of overlap with the middle of this one's life. So then we can say, if we count back those tree rings, because those rings grow every year, if this was 50 years ago, there's another 30 tree rings before that one. So this is probably 30 years older than that, so it's 80 years old. And you can sort of push that range back the further and further you get. And so there are places in the world where we have a really deep dendrochronological history that goes back hundreds of years. And so when we find a piece of wood, we can look at its tree rings, if the wood is aligned the right way, if we have the right part of the tree, and sort of figure out where in that range it fits, and get an idea of exactly when that tree was cut down. So either when it was cut down, if you can see the outside of it, or at least give a sense of when it was alive. So just another way of dating things that we can use archaeologically. I think that was pretty neat, the way that they can use just the natural environments and the way that things develop naturally to sort of figure out when something was alive. So I think that's pretty good basis for understanding. We've talked about what sites are, we've talked about objects and features, we've talked a lot about context, we've talked about excavation and what happens afterwards, and we've talked a little bit about dating. And I think those are really the big things in archaeology that I would want people to sort of understand about what it is that we do. So I do have some other questions here. Again, if anybody has any other ones, please feel free to jump in. If there's anything that I haven't explained, please do feel free to do so. And if you're not seeing this live, but you'd still like to leave a comment about a question, somebody on the staff can come back and answer that for you later. So the big one I get a lot, and I feel like a lot of archaeologists get, is what's the difference between paleontology and archaeology, or where are the dinosaurs? So, as I've hopefully made clear in this talk, archaeology is really about people. So dinosaurs is not really something that we're looking for. Now paleontology, which is a study of fossils, does use a lot of the same techniques. So they also use excavation, for example, and their methods of excavation are also very careful and scientific and rigorous. So there's a lot of, I think, visual overlap. If you're not really sure what's happening, excuse me, and you go up to a site where you see some people, they've got a nice square like holes dug, and they're being very careful with what they're doing. Visually, you might not know right away, hey, is this archaeology or is it paleontology? So I think that's maybe where some of that confusion comes in. The important thing to understand and to keep in your head is that archaeology is about the study of people in the past. And people and dinosaurs don't really so much overlap. So that's really one of the big questions that we get a lot of the times, where people will ask us about dinosaurs, and we're like, I don't really know. I would ask my 3-year-old nephew. He probably can tell you more about dinosaurs than me. So another question, again, sorry about the barking in the background. Another question I've seen a lot, especially going around on social media, is how old does something have to be before it's considered to be archaeology? And so this is kind of there's a sort of two answers to this question. The first one is sort of a legal answer. So again, in Ontario, archaeology is regulated legally through the Heritage Act, and it sort of defines archaeological sites as anything that, or defines the limit for archaeology as being about 50 years. And I think this is common in the States as well. I think that's where the cutoff is. So there's sort of that time frame is about that 50-year period. But for me, archaeology is less about the time period that you're looking at and more about the approach. So if something is 50 years old, or 50 or more years old, and you're just going to go out there with a shovel and dig it up, that's not archaeology. That's something different. That's maybe pot hunting or looting, but it's not archaeology really has to involve that rigorous recording and that understanding that context is very important. That's really what makes it archaeology, and not the time frame. So there are archaeologists today who are actually studying much more recent remains than 50 years old. And that's because they're trying to understand the patterns that people today use to dispose of garbage, for example, and then try and look at how people's behaviors today might align with and help us understand peoples of the past. So they're looking at what sites that aren't really old themselves, but the information that they're getting from doing that kind of research on modern garbage, for example, is going to help them understand what they're seeing when it does come to peoples of the past. So again, it's not necessarily about the time frame. It's really about the methodology and the perspective and that context that really is the difference between what is archaeology and what isn't. Context, context, context. The other questions that I've gotten quite a bit when I've been doing archaeology in the field is, have you found any gold yet? Have you found any treasures? What's the most valuable thing that you're finding? And again, the answer to this question goes back to context. So finding one object, whether it's, particular, like, fancy in and of itself, whether or not it's valuable, if it's gold, isn't really going to answer as many questions as if we find a whole bunch of really boring objects all together. So that context and being able to relate things to each other is much more valuable to us as archaeologists than, one piece of gold or, one valuable item. So again, it goes back to that methodology, the recording, and the context that gives things value to us as archaeologists. So one of the things I like to say about the museum collections is because we have all of these archaeological materials, a lot of it is broken stuff, like bits of broken stone, bits of broken pottery. They're not really the sorts of things that we're going to necessarily put into an exhibit that's going to show people, or going to be visually interesting and be a good showcase for people. But all of those little pieces together are what help us understand the rest of the collections that come from a site. So even though the small individual objects themselves might not have much value, they're very useful for us in trying to understand that bigger picture and put together that context. And then I had a question also from my uncle, actually, which is, what is the best thing that I have found? And if I, step back from the whole notion of context and being able to understand things together to make the interpretations, if you're just asking me, like, what is the most interesting object that I personally have found, I can answer that question. I found, it was a little button, a tiny little button with two little kissing lovebirds that I found, again, during my archaeological work in the Bahamas. And if people are interested, I can leave I have photos of that, and I can leave that in the comments for you. But it was just a neat, tiny, like, very cute, pretty, interesting object that I haven't really seen a lot of examples of. So for me, that was probably the most interesting, fun, neat thing that I have personally found, that at least that I can remember in this particular moment. So I don't see that there's any more questions at the moment. I hope that that's been interesting for everyone. And thank you for joining us. And again, we'll see you tomorrow again at 1 o'clock for the next live stream. So thanks again. Have a great day.